This is the kind of crazy math about cooling. Cooling assets require a huge amount of energy. And when they break and fail, they have a lot of side effects. If you're in the food industry, you waste a lot of product. And so that's a very significant portion of the food waste problem. And then on top of those two facts, these pieces of equipment use really, really warming chemicals called refrigerants, but they're leaked as this equipment ages. So all three of those factors make cooling responsible for like 8% of all global warming. And ironically, as the planet warms, we need more cooling. So it makes for what I call the cooling crisis. That's really where we think we can make an impact with technology.
Hi, folks. I'm Conor Gaughan, and welcome to Consensus in Conversation, a podcast where we're talking with innovators, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders who are committed to building successful businesses that also help us build a better world. When you think about the most impactful American of the 20th century, what names come to mind? It's sort of hard to quantify, but there are some standard names I think most people think of. Franklin or Eleanor Roosevelt, Martin Luther King, Jackie Robinson, Helen Keller. If you're artistically inclined, maybe you lean towards names like Louis Armstrong or Toni Morrison. Or since it's topical, if you're looking through a for better or worse lens, it's hard to argue against Oppenheimer making the top 10. Personally, though, I tend to think that the influence of innovators and inventors truly extends the furthest. The Wright brothers, Farnsworth, Steve Jobs, regardless of our political affiliations or racial identities or even cultural tastes, nearly every single one of us has used and benefited from their creations almost every day of our lives. Their names are rightly famous because the technology they developed has become the bedrock of our modern world. But there's another name that deserves to be mentioned in that list of innovators that I'm guessing not as many folks are familiar with. And I want to do my part to change that because he's one of the most inspiring and important Americans that far too few people have ever heard of. And without his work, we wouldn't be having the conversation we're having today. His name was Frederick McKinley Jones. He was the first Black recipient of the National Medal of Technology, and he was a true American success story in the most classic of molds. His engineering genius was completely self-taught. Born in Kentucky in 1893, he dropped out of school in the 6th grade, working as a janitor in an auto mechanic shop where he watched and learned everything he could about machines. Within 3 years, he'd become the shop foreman and was building his own racing cars. He served in World War I and was promoted to sergeant for his engineering expertise, training fellow soldiers in new technologies like phones and motor vehicles. After the war, he went back to inventing. He created one of the first systems that could sync motion pictures with recorded audio, and designed one of the first portable X-ray machines. In fact, throughout his life, Jones accumulated over 60 patents on his inventions. But the really important one, the one that's the reason we're talking about him today, came in 1938, and it was the result of a $6 wager. Jones' boss, Joseph Numero, had a friend in the trucking industry who was having problems getting the meat he was shipping to market before it spoiled. Numero bet his friend $6 that he had an engineer on his staff who could solve that problem in just 30 days. Jones, of course, won that bet for his boss, and in the process, totally changed the world. Because his solution turned out to be one of the most important technologies, not just of the 20th century, but arguably in all of human history: mobile refrigeration. And not only did Jones invent it, he also figured out how to commercialize it. He and Numero together built a new company to develop the technology, Thermo King, which still is around today, by the way. And in 1941, Jones patented the Thermo King Model C, a self-contained portable refrigeration unit with a built-in engine to run independently of the main truck engine and a rigid metal framework that made it resistant to the shocks and vibrations of the road. In short, it was a complete and utter game-changer, a paradigm shift for the shipping and supply chain industry, on par with what the telegraph had done for communications or the automobile for personal transportation. Nearly overnight, it made something that was previously impossible become possible, moving perishable goods like produce or medical supplies across national and international scale distances without spoilage. The Model C system proved its value during World War II, with Jones providing units to the U.S. military to help supply frontline soldiers on remote Pacific islands with fresh meat, vaccines, and blood plasma, as well as air conditioning for field hospitals. After the war, Jones released the system for commercial use, and it revolutionized, well, just about everything. To give you a scale of just how immense the contribution his invention has been to modern society, every single dosage of the COVID-19 vaccine that has been administered has relied on mobile refrigeration technology to make it safely to patients. That's a huge amount of lives saved right there. But it's actually just the teaser fact. Here's the really crazy number. 75% of all food consumed in America is transported by refrigerated trucks that use the technology Jones invented. His invention didn't just change the way shipping is done. It completely changed the way we eat. It enabled the modern supermarket. It's the reason that we can eat any kind of fruit or vegetable at any season. The reason we can import fruits from overseas that are hard to grow at home. 99.9% of bananas in the US are imported using refrigerated shipping. If you've eaten a banana recently, thank Frederick McKinley Jones. His name is worth celebrating. Jones technology is the cornerstone of what today we call the cold chain, a truly vital aspect of the modern world. But surprisingly, there hasn't been a lot of innovation in the field since it was developed. Cooling technology has lagged way behind the rest of the sustainability and clean energy transition, and is today one of the single largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. And so, in the pioneering spirit of the field's original hero, my guest today is out to change the cold chain game once again. Manik Suri is the founder and CEO of GlacierGrid, an exciting startup working to build cold chain 2.0 by bringing smart technology to cooling. Their cutting-edge but user-friendly technology harnesses advanced monitoring, remote operation, and machine learning-backed automation to create a smart energy management platform for cooling assets, helping businesses reduce waste, improve sustainability, and also save a ton of money. Manik's got one of the craziest CVs I've ever seen. Top of his class at Harvard, which for the record was far above my ranking, master's in international relations from Cambridge, back to Harvard for his law degree, with career stops at institutions like D.E. Shaw and the White House Economic Council, and as co-founder of the Governance Lab. He is a certified rock star, but he's also deeply passionate about using his skills to make a positive impact. And I was super excited to learn from him about his mission. So let's jump into the conversation. Thanks so much for joining. We're super excited. So we've got lots to talk about on the business side, but I kind of want to just start well before that and get a little sense of how you became the powerhouse that you are. So let's start at the beginning. Tell us about where you're from and where you were raised.
Yeah, grew up kind of all over, but it comes full circle. My parents were immigrants to the US. They came over from India in the early 80s. Initially, we lived in New York. They were academic physicians at Columbia. And then my dad decided he wanted a small town life with no snow, no commute. So we moved to the Central Valley in California, a small city called Fresno. So I grew up in the Central Valley and lived there till high school. And now I work on kind of farm to fork.
Amazing. And you mentioned your folks were both academics, physicians. I'm curious how that impacted your upbringing. Did you think that's the path that you were going to take?
I kind of never liked blood, and I never liked hospitals. So pretty early on, I realized I wasn't going to be pursuing a path in medicine.
Did you know, did you have a sense of what it is you wanted to do? Did you know that you wanted to be an entrepreneur someday?
You know, it wasn't a guaranteed path. I think I was always interested in entrepreneurship. Just the idea of building and being one's own boss, so to speak, was always appealing. My parents both ended up starting their own practices when I was in elementary school, when we moved out to California. And I got to see them do that. But it wasn't something I studied. You know, I studied to go into government and public policy, political science, law school. So I was planning for more of a traditional public policy kind of life.
But certainly you were raised in a very high achieving family with two physicians as parents and followed in those footsteps, I know.
Yes, there was definitely a kind of prioritization for reading and writing, but also just kind of exploring the world was important. And I think my parents definitely instilled in my brother and myself a kind of idea that education matters and learning about the world is important.
And we share an alma mater. You end up going to Harvard. So I'll start with a natural question, which is what house were you in?
I was in Dunster House.
Okay. I was Kirkland.
Nice.
So the question I ask any Harvard guest I have is can you get a grounding of who you're talking to on this?
Totally. Houses matter. Those things matter. I mean, it's not like Slytherin or Gryffindor, but definitely a formative part of my life.
How did you end up there? What was the path to that? I mean, in my experience, fewer folks are from the Central Coast or from, where I was from, the suburbs of Denver. There is a high concentration of the big cities that make up a big portion of a lot of those classes. What was your path to Harvard?
So I was kind of always interested in, I think, government and public policy, even as early as high school. And I grew up in an environment where we didn't have access to the same kind of connections and establishment that you might get in a place like Harvard. But at the time, I think Stanford was my top school. I ended up getting into Harvard, and my parents basically encouraged me to go back east and try and learn more about the kind of Ivy League approach. The idea was, hey, you're from California, you can always come back. But if you're really interested in government, the government's on the East Coast, maybe worth spending more time out there.
And what was the experience like? What do you kind of look back on your time and think about that experience?
Amazing. Some of the best years of my life. I loved college. I met my wife freshman week, first week of school at CVS in Harvard Square. We dated for like 12 years and then got married. So I have that to credit. And I think just meeting a lot of friends there and kind of a lot of formative experiences as a young student. I think I found that coming from a small town, it was a little refreshing because I didn't go to like a feeder school. I got a big public school. And so I ended up with friends who'd gone to places like Exeter and Andover and Harvard Westlake. But there was something really refreshing about just being from a small town or a smaller city. Fresno feels in many ways like a village, even though it's like 700,000 people. And that was, I think, really grounding for me. So I did well. I was a good student. I was top of my class in the college and also in high school. So I had that going for me. But it was a super fun time too.
Yeah. And that's where our paths diverge. I was not top of the class.
But you probably had more fun than I did. So
I remember a lot of those same sorts of, I remember freshman week talking to folks that became longtime friends. And that was the moment I realized, wait, these schools, these Exeters and these Andovers, they're not just a figment of movies like that. They're real places that actually exist where parents sent their children to be educated.
It's a thing.
I really thought it was at best fictional history,
Yep. It's a different world in some ways.
And so you clearly knew you wanted to study government there.
I did. Yeah. I was interested in kind of understanding how society is shaped. And I think I came from a family that was very into service. That was a big part of the culture.
Yeah.
My parents are doctors and 3 of my grandparents are physicians, both of my grandfathers and my mom's mom. So I had a lot of physicians and both my grandfathers were in the army back in India. One was a general, the other was a colonel. So there was a lot of kind of military and medicine, which has a lot of service to it. Yeah. And so I knew I was interested in public service, but wasn't sure what that meant. At 18, you don't really know. I mean, I didn't have a lot of exposure to the government aside from kind of volunteering locally. Yeah. And 9/11 was the first day of class for us in my freshman year. So I became an international relations major within a week.
Wow. Yeah. That was the first week of my senior year. I remember everything about that day. So many of us do, I think. And then what was the immediate path after graduation? Where did you take that?
Yeah, I did an internship my junior year working as a speechwriter for Madeleine Albright. She was a former Secretary of State under Bill Clinton. She had left government to start a consulting firm called the Albright Group. And I was a good student, so I got this prestigious internship called the IOP President's Internship. They kind of picked 3 or 4 amazing opportunities for undergrads. And one was to be a speechwriter for Secretary Albright. And I remember her telling me, if you want to get into public service and government and be effective, you have to understand business and how business and finance work. And I had no experience with finance or business. I'd taken like one class. Harvard doesn't often too many classes and practical topics like finance. And I ended up deciding to do that. So I went to a big investment firm called D.E. Shaw and ended up working for the gentleman who ran the firm, Lou Salkind. And it's one of the largest investment firms in the world, but at the time wasn't super well known. It was kind of known as a quantitative hedge fund that was becoming other things. They were opening up investing arms in Asia. And I had studied India and China. So my thesis, my senior year was on US-India relations. And I'd done a master's actually in between at Cambridge back in England as the John Harvard Scholar. So I ended up with a little bit of experience in Asia as a student. And I thought, okay, this is an opportunity to actually get out there and learn about how things work. And so I went into private equity, investing in emerging markets based out of Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Delhi for 3.5 years at D.E. Shaw. That was kind of my first job.
And then returned to school.
And I deferred law school for 5 years.
5 years is a long time to defer.
It was a long time. I was not planning to defer for 5 years. I was planning to go right after this fellowship, this kind of master's in England. Yeah. I got this amazing opportunity at D.E. Shaw and decided to take it. And the job turned out to be just much better than I could have expected. A lot of autonomy, a lot of resources, a lot of room to learn. And so I kept deferring. I kept writing in saying, I'll come, but one more year.
What pulled you back in? Because I feel like I would have given up after 5 years and just...
Yeah. No, most of my friends thought I was crazy. I had an exceptionally lucrative and interesting job as a young person. And again, I think it was the kind of grounding my parents and my family had given me, which was in something around service and doing work in life that makes an impact on society. And It sounds trite, but it was really quite central to our ethos. My brother is a primary care physician, works with indigent populations. He also went to Harvard for college and med school. And so I couldn't see myself just making money for other people as the highest calling. Even though the job was really interesting, a bunch of my friends had gone to work for Senator Obama when he was running for office. He ended up winning in a kind of a historic campaign. And at the time, I joked that I'm more of a West Wing than a House of Cards kind of generation. So I actually believed in the power of government to do good. Yeah. And when President Obama came into office, I knew a number of people who were joining that administration. And it just seemed like you could actually change things in the government. And there was a possibility of a better future. And he had gone to Harvard for law school. And I thought, okay, well, he's amazing. I'm inspired. Let me go do that. And let me try and be part of that kind of line of work. So I went back to law school.
I mean, for those of us that know, I grew up loving West Wing and now realize that DC is a lot more like Veep than anything else. I think that's the closest comparison in reality.
Funny because it's true.
So as you went back to law school, was the plan was more of a public service, public policy, maybe not so much like a litigator that you were looking to do?
I was pretty sure I didn't want to be a lawyer going into law school, which made me like everyone else who was going to law school, at least at HLS. But I was interested in government. So I did my first summer in the White House at the National Economic Council and then ended up getting a fellowship to work there for another year. So I worked in DC while in law school for a year and a half in the administration, doing economic policy on Larry Summer and Gene Sperling's team at NEC. I was the junior most guy in the team, basically, of 20.
As you think about kind of whether it's D.E. Shaw, the White House Economic Council, or any other jobs that you've had on your path towards building a business, I'm curious if any experiences jump out to you as those that have been the most relevant, the most additive, that you would think were the most impactful to where you are now?
I think it all adds up. I think our life is a sum of the parts and the journey makes sense in the rearview mirror, but not always while we're kind of taking the twists and the turns. I would say it was a really valuable training to work in places like D.E. Shaw and the White House, in the sense that I worked around extremely motivated, very thoughtful, very high competency people, just really high caliber humans. It was the hardest transition I ever made when I went from being part of large, well-resourced, prestigious organizations to starting a startup as a bootstrapped first-time entrepreneur with no capital, no team, no product, no experience. And I went from like a role where I'd had like anyone taking my calls. When you email people or message people from the White House or D.E. Shaw, pretty much everyone responds affirmatively. And when you have the beginnings of an idea and no resources, it is extremely humbling. It is extremely humbling. So the hardest years of kind of my professional life were definitely the first few years as an entrepreneur, where the training was extremely valuable. And at the same time, I had no idea what I was signing up for.
So let's talk about the founding. Let's talk about those early days. Give us the founding story. I know you had actually begun building or founded another app, CoInspect, that you're working on when this idea came to you.
Yes.
So maybe give us like a little bit of that, set the stage for us, and then give us the aha moment where the seed that would become GlacierGrid takes place.
Yeah. Well, CoInspect was kind of a natural step out of the work I was doing previously. And GlacierGrid was truly a pivot. The idea to go into entrepreneurship came from a colleague of mine. So after leaving the White House role as a junior person and deciding not to be a lawyer, I graduated from law school and started a center at NYU and MIT with the deputy CTO when she was leaving the Obama administration, Beth Novick. She'd gone to Harvard 10 years before me and had gone to Yale for law school, taught herself how to write code, super interesting human and very just kind of multidisciplinary. And she had started working on this space around building tech for good or building tech around civic problems. And I listened to her give a talk on a book she had written. Then I read the book. The book was called WikiGov. The thesis was tech is transforming life, social and commercial, but people aren't building solutions for big public problems like safety, sustainability, and governance. And I got super inspired. Was interested in impact and service, but wanted to do it in a scalable way and decided to join her and started this center as the co-founder. We raised about $20 million of grant funding for it back in 2013, 2014. And I did that for a couple of years and realized that to build technology to scale, you couldn't do it in a do tank. You actually had to get a for-profit structure because we had these amazing people join us for 6 to 12 months, and then they would go back to Meta or Google or wherever they were getting paid really well with lots of equity upside. And so I started a company. And the idea was like, let's work on safety and sustainability. Let me find a vertical where those problems matter. And I was visiting my parents in Fresno. They still live there. And I was talking to a bunch of family friends in the food and agricultural industries, just grew up around farms and growers.
Yep.
And what people were saying was, hey, Silicon Valley is an hour away from San Joaquin Valley, but no one comes across the mountains to talk to us. So we're using tech from the 50s over here. And at the time, Chipotle had a bunch of food safety and quality issues. They were in the news a ton, and their market cap had fallen like 42% because of food safety problems. And I remember thinking, like, food is a massive industry. It's like $1 trillion industry. How could it be that they're using like pen and paper everywhere? That just seems crazy.
Right.
And mobile was becoming a thing because everyone was getting smart devices, smartphones and tablets were getting cheaper and more accessible. So Co-Inspect, Collaborative Inspect, the first company I launched, was focused on modernizing that problem around safety and quality for folks in the farm to fork supply chain. We replaced paper and pen with mobile apps. And we scaled that between 2016 and 19 to about 5,000 locations, raised a little bit of capital. And we discovered that we were solving an interesting problem, but we were solving it the wrong way. Turned out that most of what people were checking with our mobile app was temperature. The biggest thing that matters for food is keeping it in the right temperature zones, both for quality and for safety purposes. Whether that's produce or proteins, it's kind of the single biggest thing that matters. And we were basically replacing a paper clipboard with a digital clipboard, which is only marginally better. You still have to check it 4 to 8 times a day. And what we didn't appreciate, Conor, and this is really the biggest learning, I was scaling this product. I was, flying around the country. I think I went to like 40 states selling Co-Inspect. No one ever said to me that we were actually making the workflow harder. But it turned out that we were replacing an analog, manual workflow with a digital one, but actually making the work harder for both users and customers. So for the user, those are employees working in a distribution center or an agricultural facility or a restaurant or a convenience store. Basically, we were requiring timestamps, geolocation, and photo uploads, which makes the task super accurate.
Right.
But it means you have to do it exactly at the spot, exactly at the time, and exactly the right way. And for decades, they've been using paper books, which you can choose to mark however you want, whenever you want. It's a lot less validated. Right. The joke in the industry, the phrase is called pencil whipping. Pencil whipping is where you go through and say, yep, everything's good here, all fine and good. So we were making it a lot harder by requiring work to be done in a very specific, very validated way. And as a result, what was happening was users were having to do a lot more and getting frustrated. And then for the owners, the buyers, we were ending up with incomplete logbooks. And you don't have to be a lawyer from Harvard to realize if you're a business and you have incomplete safety and quality logs, that's not good for business.
Yeah.
And so no one ever said to me in a single meeting anywhere in the country that this is a bad idea. It was always like, this is great. We should totally do this. We should absolutely adopt this. But growth was slow. Expansion was hard. Revenue took forever to build. And one of my friends had said to me early on that if you want to change the world, you must first accept it. And I didn't realize, but we were kind of fighting human nature with Co-Inspect. We were trying to make people do the right thing, but making it hard for them. And that's how the idea for what's now GlacierGrid came to be. We realized we should just automate this with sensors. And that's what led us to launch a separate product in 2020, a sensor-based approach.
Okay, so give us that quick elevator pitch. So what is then GlacierGrid?
GlacierGrid uses sensors and controls to manage cooling, refrigeration, and air conditioning in ways that reduce food cost, energy cost, and equipment cost. So we do it in ways that save businesses money on their inventory by catching loss. We help them reduce their energy bill by turning stuff down or turning it off when no one's there or no one's using it. And we catch equipment issues. All of those things reduce emissions as well. We reduce significantly carbon footprints for businesses, but we do it with a financial focus. And that's GlacierGrid. It's a clean cooling company.
And I want to dig in on the business case and the value proposition and all that. But I also know that you just recently rebranded as GlacierGrid, and it's a pretty awesome name. So I'm curious to hear the story about that switch and how you landed on that as the new name.
Yeah. Again, everything makes sense in the rearview mirror. At the time, you're kind of making twists and turns, trying to figure out like how you got here. I became an entrepreneur focused around doing good and doing well. That was the idea that got me into tech entrepreneurship 10 years ago. With Co-Inspect, we were trying to solve a problem that was important, food waste and food safety, but we were doing it the wrong way. As we discovered that we should automate the workflow, we realized that there was a new type of sensor technology that uses radio. And that can get signal out much more reliably than Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, particularly with refrigeration. Turns out it's super hard to get a wireless signal out of a fridge or a freezer because there's a kind of Faraday cage from the water content inside stuff. And so we use a radio-based sensor to get signal out reliably, got temperature and humidity monitored. And the name we gave that product was Therma. Therma is short for temperature, humidity, energy, remote monitoring application. Team of nerds. So, a nice acronym, but we liked the name Therma at the time. And the first product we launched was this kind of drop-and-play sensor. And the idea did really well. Unlike Co-Inspect, it scaled much more of a pull than a push.
Yeah.
We went from a couple of customers and a couple of sensors in January of 20 to over 1,000 customers, over 35,000 sensors deployed today. So just super exciting to see early growth, just much more natural adoption because we were saving users time. Every day, we were replacing the need to check stuff, and we were giving businesses very accurate, very complete logs with real-time data and prediction of equipment issues. So it was actually better for users and better for buyers.
Yeah.
And that turned out to be a very attractive value proposition. On top of that, we could offer CO2 emissions reduction data. We could say, hey, you're reducing food waste, catching spoilage events with thousands of dollars of inventory. That's also a climate win. And, the last few years have been increasingly warm, for those of you who hadn't noticed, and increasingly unpredictable with the weather. And the problem around climate has gotten a lot more salient for businesses. People really want to do well and do good by marketing and messaging the right thing. So all of those tailwinds turned out to be real growth drivers despite the pandemic. We launched the product just a couple of months before the COVID-19 pandemic, almost went out of money in March of 20. We raised a small round in April, renamed the company Therma, and kind of lived to fight another day. Therma took off, and in 22, we started thinking, well, what else can we do for monitoring the temperature and humidity around these pieces of refrigeration? And then we had a new idea, which was to not just monitor the temperature and the humidity, but to actually turn the equipment on and off. And again, our orientation, our kind of focus all along has been, how do we do good and do well? How do we advance safety and sustainability? We were looking at cooling, and we realized there's a huge amount of waste in the energy footprint. These businesses use a ton of electricity to cool, but a lot of the equipment's not run intelligently. So we realized that we could not just monitor, but actually turn things on and off, turn them up and down, and do it dynamically in a way that could save businesses money by turning stuff off when no one was using the equipment or no one was there in the first place. And that idea that you could actually turn stuff off turned out to be pretty powerful. And so we launched a second product, an energy optimization product, where we can turn equipment on and off while monitoring the temperature. Turns out people hadn't really done that very much, whether it's with refrigeration or, as we discovered, air conditioning. When businesses are shut, you can actually turn stuff off or turn it down. Or when businesses are opening, you can shift how much energy is used to the cheaper, earlier hours in the day, and then ride that wave the rest of the day. So you can kind of pre-cool by turning stuff off when energy is cheap and then turning it on. So we learned a bunch of things, but one of the big things we realized was these pieces of equipment are run dumb, and have been dumb for 100 years. We can bring intelligence to them with sensors and controls. And so that combination of monitoring and sensors became a new platform in 2023. And we realized we're becoming much more of an energy management company. So that was kind of the journey. Ultimately, we decided to change our name. One of the reasons was we were much more focused on cooling and energy than just temperature monitoring, which was our original offering.
Yeah.
The other was that there's a company called Therma in the HVAC space, in the air conditioning space. We had never touched air conditioning when we launched in 2020. But as we started moving into cooling more broadly, we were getting much more enmeshed in the world of air conditioning. And so ultimately we thought, let's embrace our future and the vision here. And that's how GlacierGrid was born.
I love it. One of the topics we've talked a lot about recently is this idea of the hidden economy. So the businesses, the products, the services in life that are really, really important, really fundamental, but maybe are taken for granted by folks, particularly folks who are looking for, the next unicorn because they're just not sexy. They're all kind of behind the scenes. And it feels like the cold chain, the first part of this before you get to energy management, really fits into that idea. I mean, you called it, they were run dumb before, and now you're adding brains to them. But I'm curious if you could talk to us about the cold chain, why it's so important, why it's important as a business, but also potentially as part of a more sustainable future for the country.
Yeah, cooling and the cold chain are kind of an area of the economy I never thought about. I can't say that it ever been something I'd focused on in my earlier career. But I think it's because we take it for granted, particularly in the developed world. Cooling is just part of the fabric of modern society. And turns out that it's responsible for a huge portion of modernity. The ability to have high value, high quality, and high caloric food which is something we all take for granted, say in the US, requires cold chain. We need the ability to provide supply chain to get stuff from production to people's mouths and to their plates. And that's true for produce. I grew up in the ag belt of California. It's also true for proteins. So if you want to provide people with high caloric value content and high quality content, you need to have really effective cold chain. And that's one of the reasons why there's huge amounts of malnourishment in parts of the world that don't have good cold chain. Similarly, as the world discovered in 2020, the cold chain is critical for pharmaceuticals and pharmacologics. Right. Blood, plasma, and vaccines are ultimately very temperature sensitive. The vast majority of them require really effective cold chain from end to end in order to provide people with life-saving and life-giving compounds. And so the combination of both food and pharma needs and the fact that the world is increasingly asking for and getting these things as the world develops and more populations are moving to the middle class, the cold chain is growing at like close to 10% CAGR. So very high growth rate around the world. And then on top of that, you've got air conditioning. Air conditioning is really important for comfort and convenience, which are also things we start to take for granted in the modern world. Turns out that cooling, including air conditioning, is massively underdeveloped on a per capita basis globally. The majority of the world does not have enough refrigeration or air conditioning today. But as billions of people around the world seek more food, pharmaceuticals, and access to comfort and convenience, cooling is growing really, really rapidly. And so it's a very important part of modern life, the kinds of things we take for granted, the ability to control your temperature, get nice produce in the winter, or eat whatever proteins you want to eat. On top of that, the sector is already responsible for a huge percentage of emissions. And so this is the kind of crazy math about cooling that I always find striking. When you think about the combination of the energy consumption, cooling assets require a huge amount of energy. Then on top of that, you've got the fact that a lot of them break and fail. And when they break and fail, they have a lot of side effects. One, if you're in the food industry, is you waste a lot of product. And if that happens close to the fork, close to where people eat stuff, it's very carbon intensive. If you lose steak or sushi or pork chops down in a steak shop or in a restaurant or in a convenience store, which happens surprisingly often, that's huge amounts of energy intensivity gone into growing that stuff, cultivating it, shipping it, and getting it to the steak shop. And so that's a very significant portion of the food waste problem. And then on top of those two facts, energy and food waste, these pieces of equipment use really, really warming chemicals called refrigerants. They have between 1,000 and 11,000 times the warming effect of CO2. Now, they're necessary for cooling to work. They're actually the critical compound in how cooling works, but they're leaked as this equipment ages. And so we have significant baseline leak rates of refrigerants that are causing warming as well. So all three of those factors, the energy intensivity, the food wasted, and the refrigerants leak, make cooling responsible for like 8% of all global warming. And ironically, as the planet warms, we need more cooling.
Right.
And so there's this kind of vicious feedback loop to the whole thing. And underlying all of that, cooling is growing really fast around the world. So it makes for what I call the cooling crisis. We need this stuff for humanity and for human well-being, but in the process, we're damaging planetary health and planetary well-being. So that's really where we think we can make an impact with technology.
And on the business side, it's the opportunities. You guys just recently closed your Series A, you mentioned. How did investors take to the story?
Yeah, it's generally been very positive feedback from the capital markets and from investors for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, I think commercial traction. Yeah. We've been growing between double and triple revenue growth year over year for some time. So when you're growing at a fast clip, people get excited if they're looking to make money. I think on top of that, there's also the fact this is one of those areas where people believe you can do good and do well. Our products, monitoring and energy, have a CO2e, a kind of a climate overlay. They have emissions reduction built in, but that's not how we sell them. We sell them on a financial ROI basis to business operators that are very focused on the bottom line. Our customers typically do less than 10% margin, 5 to 9% margin. So super razor thin. If you run a restaurant, a convenience store, a supermarket, you don't have free cash to invest in cool, sexy technology. You're going to buy stuff if it works and it helps you. And I think that the fact that we've been able to find a way to help these kinds of businesses save money and improve sustainability, that's gotten a lot of investors excited. I think there's a McKinsey statistic, or at least McKinsey quoted it. We need to spend $4 trillion over the next 15 years to solve the climate crisis. $4 trillion. That's a lot more capital than there is in venture capital. That's public, sovereign wealth, private, late stage, as well as venture. But the point is, huge amounts of money need to be spent on improving sustainability. I think folks got excited about our business because here's a corner of the world. There isn't a lot of innovation going on.
Right.
And we're doing something that can save businesses money and in the process reduce emissions.
How much was the sustainable and kind of climate solving opportunity part of your initial vision as you built this idea? I mean, obviously there was a business imperative and you saw it in the work you were doing, but how central to the original thesis was building a product and a service that would end up having positive downstream effects in your business model, in your business plan?
I mean, I think the first blog post we wrote about safety and sustainability was back in 2016. So my co-founder, Aaron Cohen, and I met at the governance lab, the civic tech do-gooder tank we started. Aaron's in his late 50s. This is his 6th startup. He's been the CEO of 5 startups over his career. And so we met around the idea of doing good and doing well, building technology around these themes. It's definitely core to our DNA. I think we didn't realize how hard it was to do with co-inspect, but it was part of our thinking. And with Therma, I think right away we realized that there was an opportunity here to save businesses money. What I didn't appreciate was how much of a climate problem it was. We went through a climate hardware accelerator in the winter of 2019. It was run by one of our early investors in co-inspect called Urbanus. They just rebranded as Third Sphere last year. And in that accelerator, I came across some statistics from Project Drawdown. It's a nonprofit that studies climate change. And they have an annual report that stacks all the solutions to global warming or to climate change each year. And that year, they had 80 solutions, and solution number 4 was reducing food waste. And solution number 1 out of 80 was refrigerant management, which is these chemicals in cooling. And that was kind of the aha moment for me when I realized, oh my God, this is a much bigger climate problem than I appreciated. It was always there in our DNA, but we didn't realize how big of a problem we were attacking.
I also think it's interesting to look at secondary impacts beyond just the food waste. The flip side of that equation is like there's a food security opportunity to solve for here too, right?
Absolutely. One of our first clients was the Sacramento Food Bank. And through the Sacramento Food Bank, we discovered some really startling statistics around food insecurity. It turns out like 1 in 7 Americans faces food insecurity. And we got introduced to an organization called Feeding America that we've been working with for some time, just amazing humans focused on food insecurity. So there is a definite opportunity here and something we've been trying to do by helping businesses reduce avoidable waste, reduce what they call shrink, to kind of circulate some of that back to people who really need it, whether it's here or my personal hope is that we can do this in other countries one day.
Yeah. It certainly seems like there's incredible opportunity to grow and scale and expand based on the increasing demand for cooling globally and bring with it a more efficient technology from day one instead of having to retrofit.
Definitely. That's the hope. We've deployed the monitoring product in 11 countries. So we know that you can use it and it can work in other places. But, small team, we're like less than 60 people based in the US. So it's hard to do everything at once. Absolutely. If anyone knows of opportunities internationally that our technology could help with, I'm very interested.
Well, and I do love this idea that I think it'll be core to scaling. The fact that what you've built is a technology solution that has, as its second generation, a layer of clear and clean automation, right? That helps the turning off, the starting up at a bit more appropriate time. We've had a lot of conversations the last couple of weeks with Jacob Poor at VSC Ventures, who's talking a lot about climate automation. And I'm really curious to get your thoughts as a practitioner who's really in this space and seeing the impacts of it in the restaurant industry as a client profile, how you see this as a mechanism, an opportunity to really move the needle.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of pressure right now on businesses on multiple levels. One pressure is obviously just kind of on the cost side, a combination of rising input costs. Energy costs are higher than ever, labor costs are higher than ever, food costs are higher than ever. So that just makes it super tight operating environment. But then on top of that, more and more businesses have things like consumer preferences are changing around sustainability. Government reporting requirements are shifting, particularly for public companies and larger private companies. And so we see some of our customers looking for emissions reduction or net zero technologies, things that can help them make good on their promises to reduce their footprint. And we have a few companies that are explicit in their mandate and saying, hey, we want to use GlacierGrid's tools as part of our net zero commitment. And we've done a few successful marketing campaigns around that. And I think that's only going to grow. But I do think that to get scale and to get commercial traction with these kinds of businesses, first and foremost thing you have to do is actually help them run their organizations,
Right.
either improve the top line or improve the bottom line.
Yeah. As you think about beyond what you guys are doing for industry, I'm curious if there's other kind of big innovations that you're seeing that are also exciting you, that you see as part and parcel towards getting to some of these big, aspirational, but necessary goals.
I mean, so many things going on right now that are exciting. I think technology kind of continues to surprise all of us with both the promise and the potential. But I'd say in the corner of the world that I'm in, which is around climate innovation and the built environment transformation, there's a few things that are pretty encouraging. One, you've got a lot more kind of IoT-based businesses that are emerging. So the kind of idea that you can manage what you can measure. There's folks that are working on water flow management, on lighting management, on other inputs that matter, heating, water heater, just all kinds of inputs. And I love those kinds of tools because they're practical. They solve business problems today. Yeah. They help real humans do their real jobs more effectively, and they reduce emissions. I like celebrating the unsexy. Yeah. Not that carbon sequestration isn't interesting. It's super necessary as part of a solution set for all of the possible ways we can reduce warming. But I love the kinds of solutions that can solve problems today. And I guess relatedly, there's a lot of folks that are working on the space around virtual power. The idea that you don't have to build new power plants. You can actually tap existing load and tap existing consumers and use their assets and their equipment more intelligently. That's a space GlacierGrid is moving into, but we see a lot of great players and a lot of great colleagues that are essentially bringing a combination of software and intelligence to the millions of pieces of equipment out there. Turns out if you can turn those things on and off and coordinate them more intelligently, you don't need to build really expensive and really dirty peaker plants, which require burning fossil fuels.
We've had quite a few fun conversations with a variety of folks that are innovating in this smart energy space, the demand level. And I think all too often, it's very easy to focus on energy supply as the simple solution or the biggest, easiest to see, easiest to talk about. But some of the folks that are doing innovation on the demand side, I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's kind of the less talked about or less sexy side of the energy transition is demand side as opposed to kind of supply side, the transmission side. But I think a lot of times there's outsized opportunity in working on things that others aren't working on, particularly when resources and time are limited.
Yeah, and certainly, as we all know from just our lives, that you look around and we have more and more plugs to worry about, not fewer and fewer. And so with that comes like greater and greater imperative to figure out the demand side.
Indeed. I think the problem is definitely growing. I didn't appreciate how big of a problem this was going to be when I was growing up. And I thought it was something that our grandchildren's children would have to worry about.
How has that hit you? Was there a singular moment, a singular conversation that really crystallized that? Or has this been kind of a process, an evolving process of understanding what we face and becoming engaged as part of the solution?
Well, I was definitely interested in the idea around sustainability from a young age, but it was never an existential concern growing up. I think that first time I encountered the problem in a serious way was as a college senior. I watched Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, and he came and spoke at Harvard about the movie. And, I remember thinking like, oh, wow, this is like a really serious problem for my grandchildren to worry about. Not like, oh my God, we have to solve this in our generation. Fast forwarding a few years, when I was at D.E. Shaw, I worked on clean tech investing. D.E. Shaw was one of the early significant investors in clean tech 1.0. They had one of the largest portfolios of offshore wind, renewable or clean coal, kind of modern battery technologies in their venture portfolio and in their private equity portfolio, some of which have been spun out into much larger companies 15 years later. But I got to see some of those technologies as a clean tech investor. And then I really got interested in the space as I saw we were looking at big public problems at the governance lab. And we were stacking all the societal problems in terms of like existential. And that was around the time when sustainability and warming were becoming known. This is about 10, 11 years ago. People in the broad policy environment were saying, okay, this has to be dealt with now. This is a future thing. It got super personal for me years later. In 2017, I took my wife on an anniversary trip to Napa, and we were staying in this lovely inn, the Four Sisters Inn in Kenwood. And it was the first night we were there was the night of the largest wildfires in California history at the time. We weren't expecting it. We were like, had no idea because it was really windy. We were eating in Sonoma Town Square and it was super windy, like weirdly so. There was leaves blowing into the restaurant and they had to shut the windows, I remember. We went to bed and we were woken up at 2 a.m. by the innkeeper who was just banging on the door saying, get out of your room, get out of your room. You collect in the lobby. And we got out of the room and there was like orange in the horizon, not far away. And the innkeeper, who was new to California, was saying, I think we should all jump in the pool and just sit in the pool. And my wife was like, no way, get in the car, I'm driving home. And we ended up jumping in the car and driving at like 80 miles an hour through forest fire on both sides of the highway. And like 20 fire trucks went by us. We took us 4 hours, but we made it home. That was the first night of what became one of the worst wildfires in history. And then 2 years later, 30 minutes from my parents' house in Fresno, the region around Shaver Lake and Huntington, where I used to go hiking, burned up. And a bunch of my school teachers lost their cabins and friends lost their cabins up there. So it kind of started to get personal over the last several years, but intellectually, it was interesting for some time.
Let me ask kind of a follow-up question, which is, I think various folks react different ways to these impetus that we see in the world, whether it's living through, experiencing the real world effects of the changing climate and extreme weather, or simply the headlines that we see on a regular basis, the newest data that projects something more ominous more quickly than we expected. I'm curious how you, in light of kind of living through those realities that shake us to our core, like the forest fires in California, how do you stay hopeful and channel that energy towards a solution? How do you defeat defeatism?
Really appreciate that question, Conor. I think that's such an important question to ask, all of us to ask ourselves. I mean, you look at the news cycle and it's like one negative thing after another every day, every year, for years. It is heavy out there. I think that it's very natural, very human, and very easy to then want to go and watch like an Avengers film or something that's like, get me the hell out of this place. I cannot think about this for another minute. So I think that's pretty natural. I think that being surrounded by young people, being surrounded by builders and doers helps a lot. I always got inspired, again, family values and what you grew up with. My grandfather worked until he was 79. He had ALS and he was a neurologist. He diagnosed himself and worked until he couldn't move. My mom's mom is 94. She's a doctor. She worked until she was 88 in a free clinic in Delhi. So I kind of got inspired by seeing my parents still work full time. They're in their late 60s. I think that being around people who are like off the mindset of the Gandhi kind of be the change you want to see in the world, as opposed to it's very easy to critique and criticize. That doesn't take nearly as much courage and conviction. And so I guess surrounding oneself with doers and like-minded people, and then seeing the end kind of results and try to not spend too much time reading the news. And I like to know what's going on in the world, but I try not to. We don't have TV in our house. I try to limit the amount of exposure I have to the negativity. Sometimes easier said, but
the doom scrolling does
helps.
not help. I will say that. Well, I want to wrap up with another easy one. Where can folks find more about GlacierGrid? What talks or events or products do you have coming up that you want folks to check in on and read about? Where can we send people to learn more?
Yeah, would love to chat further if anyone's interested. I'm at Manik@GlacierGrid.com. Manik Suri on Twitter. GlacierGrid is on all the social under GlacierGrid. It's GlacierGrid.com. But yeah, Manik, MANIK at GlacierGrid.com if you want to chat further. We go to a few energy and hospitality events, but we're excited to partner with and chat with anyone who cares about clean cooling and the future of the planet.
Big thanks to Manik Suri for joining us on the show today. I feel really inspired by his sense of service and his dedication to bringing entrepreneurship to solving one of the biggest unseen challenges of our day. I think he's absolutely right that we take cooling, refrigeration, and HVAC a little bit for granted in the more developed world. It's really important for all of us to just take a step back and appreciate what an impactful, life-changing technology it actually has been and how fortunate we are to have it. But then also that we not be complacent, that we roll up our sleeves and go to work to make the technology even better, make it more affordable, more sustainable. To reduce our own carbon footprint, yeah, but also pave the way for the developing world to adopt cleaner, better, more cost-effective cooling. As mentioned, if you want to learn more about GlacierGrid's work, check out some of their case studies or explore career opportunities with them. You can visit their website at GlacierGrid.com. If you've got some specific questions, or if GlacierGrid might be a solution for your business needs, get in touch with Manik directly. You can email him at manik@glaciergrid.com. Or you can connect with him on social media. He's at Manik Suri at LinkedIn and at Manik V Suri on X. Don't worry, we'll have all those links for you in the show notes. As for us, you can reach us by email at cic@consensus-digital.com. That's cic@consensus-digital.com. Or you can connect with me directly on LinkedIn or Threads at CKGaughan. That's at CKGONE. We'd love for you to reach out with any questions, comments, or ideas sparked by today's chat. Or if you have a great suggestion for a future guest. We would love to hear your thoughts and get your feedback. It's always fun to connect with folks who share our passion for these topics and helps us to make a better show. Finally, if you did enjoy the show today, the best way you can support us is to give us a follow, a like, or leave a review wherever you listen. That really helps us grow our reach and continue bringing you more awesome conversations with the business leaders you want to hear from. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week with a brand new conversation. Consensus in Conversation is hosted and executive produced by me, Conor Gaughan. The episode was produced by Will Gatchell and Jeff Rock with editing from the good folks at Reasonable Volume. Special thanks to the Consensus team, including creative director Kate Tucker, Greg Hergel on research, and Patrick Gallagher on strategy. Consensus in Conversation can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. Consensus in Conversation is a podcast by Consensus Digital Media, produced in association with Reasonable Volume.